So, hello, Professor Barnes.
Hi, Anele.
It's been a while that we have kind of engaged and spoke through some things that have to do with psychology and decolonization. And thank you for welcoming us to your home. In the African sense of where we come from, we say Togozani, meaning that we're greeting you and the Barnes and those who are part of this space. And so, and thank you for creating this time. So today we are basically talking about psychology and decolonization. I know you're a prof in psychology. And in our university, at UJ, we believe in core values of many things about diversity. And I believe that decolonization is part of diversity of knowledge systems and ways of how we talk and do psychology. But today, I really want us to foster our minds into talking around decolonization. Maybe you can just do a bit of greetings and introduction as Professor Barnes.
Thanks, Anele. It's lovely to engage with you again and to work with you again. Anele and I, for those listening in, did some work on decolonization and psychology, and we put together a special issue as co-editors in 2018, but have engaged over the years on matters of African-centered psychology as well as decolonization. So it's lovely to be here. Like you said, I'm a professor of psychology. At the moment, I do more administrative work in the faculty rather than academic work, but my interests and my heart and passion still lie in psychology. And that's me. I look forward to chatting with you.
Great. Maybe I should do a bit of introduction for people to know that Anele Siswana. I'm a clinical psychologist by profession. I am also a lecturer in the Department of Psychology. And I'm a traditional healer as well. So I bring in all of these intersections of culture, tradition, queer understandings and all of that which you do. But I remember what we did in 2018 was such an amazing job of putting up articles and people commenting on different aspects of the economy. But I'd like us to take you to take us through your understanding and the sense of where we are around decolonization in higher education.
Thanks, Anele. My take is that decolonization was a very, very powerful moment and movement within higher education and within psychology itself. Now, we must just be clear that a decolonization means different things to different people. And that we should avoid trying to define or box in our understandings of decolonization. I think as scholars in the university, it's important for us to think through what this might mean, but also where we should be cautious and how we should take these ideas forward. So I would like to say that in higher education, the movement, especially around the fees must fall and the subsequent issues that we dealt with post fees must fall, have really played an important part in how we think about decolonization in psychology in particular. So there are many, many, many things that we could talk about. And like I said earlier, it means different things to different people. For some, it was about replacing perhaps knowledge that had been produced in particular contexts with another set of knowledges. For others, it's about reclaiming space within the academy and within psychology. For others, it was around the values, particularly around inclusivity and respect. While for others, it was around creating a new way and a new set of languages to be able to express ourselves within the discipline and within higher education in particular. So that's the starting point, and I think it's had a huge effect, huge impact, especially as we head into new socio-political eras and priorities in the country in higher education and in psychology.
Okay, great. And for me, to be quite specific, do you think the discipline of psychology has responded quite well in relation to decolonization, and probably to stretch it further to what we call African-centered psychology? Are these things different or they are mutually exclusive when we talk of decolonization and African-centered psychology?
So the first question, I think, is a good one. Has psychology been slow? I think psychology traditionally has been quite slow with any kind of critical movements. But I do think, particularly at the University of Johannesburg, there was a lot of change. There was a lot of meaningful change, I think, in the curriculum, in the way we teach, in the way we engage students, in the way in which we did research. But a lot more could be done. I think African-centered psychology is indeed part of a broader line of thinking of decolonization. We should be careful of not conflating the two. Because there are other areas in which decolonization can be claimed, especially with regards to what I call the silent revolutions that often happen in the academy. And here we're talking about curriculum change, we're talking about the way in which we engage in students. I think most departments at the University of Johannesburg have engaged with ideas of decolonization. There are aspects of psychology in particular that really did throw themselves into these debates. And I'm using the term debate purposefully here. Again, not to force ideas onto people, but really for people to engage, scholars to engage, academics to engage, students to engage in the various debates, to give them a more holistic feel of the potential for psychology. And I think that's happened quite meaningfully, particularly in some subjects in psychology. Subjects that come to mind as in, for example, community psychology, health psychology, social psychology. At the higher levels of professional training, the psychology department introduced training in African-centered psychology. And people like you and Ele have also brought in nice ideas around the training of our students, as well as the conscientization of academics around it. So to me, it's not a once-off event, and it's not necessarily an event that can be put into a box, but it's small steps, quiet steps, and it's an ongoing project.
Great.
I might add that it's an ongoing project that started way before the term decolonization re-entered the discipline. So, in our recent history, you look at movements around feminism, you look at movements around queer theory, before that critical theory, political psychology, all of those kinds of things that have addressed many issues. Yeah, so I was saying that, Anele, we also have to look at recent history of the discipline, and decolonization, dovetailed with a lot of important issues that the discipline was grappling with to begin with. And there were two really important things. The first was the question of relevance.
Relevance is definitely.
That has been debated post-apartheid, and obviously debated during apartheid, the relevance of psychology in society. And the other is inclusivity and diversity.
Definitely.
And those two issues really came together nicely around questions of decolonization. Subsequent to that, we've had to engage with questions of decolonization in relation to other major societal events, for example, at the moment 4IR at UJ, and in society. And how do we respond? Do we see these as mutually exclusive, or do we see these as working together? Now, of course, I believe that we can see them as working together and can have important impacts. Your second question, Anele, is around whether we see African-centered psychology as mutually exclusive to decolonization. And of course not, yes. Of course not. But we must see it in terms of a bigger picture.
Yeah, and I think I like the idea of an African-centered psychology, and people often ask, how does this even look like in teaching and in practice and in all of that? And for me, the difficulty is always, whenever we speak of African-centered approaches, there's no reference of academic scientific text. It's only now that people like Ratele, the Sibas, Ramoses, and many others who are into that, they're trying to establish a sense of credibility around defining what African-centered psychology is, what it is not, because the assumption is it's all a mumbo jumbo kind of a thing, that there's no specific kind of science that informs that. But I believe that as Africans, we've always had our own ways of constructing knowledge and disseminating knowledge. I know you are a big fan of us not being too protective of the kind of knowledge systems that articles are sold. This is part of the decolonization movement and all of that. And with African ways of knowing, it's been oral tradition. It has been these traditions that are non-scientific in a way. So for some of us who are doing this work, there's still so much of credibility, work, and need and relevance of normalizing and theorizing, thinking differently. I don't know of any theory that is African-centered, but there are certain ways in which we can draw from that aspect. But I think on the first part, you've helped us to understand what decolonization is and what it is not, and some of the pitfalls that we need to be quite mindful of. But I think now we can move on to the other segment around probably some of your thoughts that you've probably thought about how I do this in therapy, of how it looks like, because beyond being an academic, there's a point where I have to sit down and how does this even look like? I have to bring on the underground gang, I call it the underground gang, the ancestors, where they throwing information, like tell this person this and all of that. By the time someone sits, already I have a script. Them and again, I always find this, Brendan, that when I go to private practice, there's been a point where when I started training, I used to have my cloth. So I would wrap it on my around me, and I had my beads on, and sometimes I would have beads, and people can already construct a narrative by just seeing the beads. And so for me, being in that space and being trained psychodynamically, where anonymity and privacy and all of that, I've been quite conflicted. And for me, where I'm at now, I'm curious to actually hear my colleagues as to their impressions of how do I experience this. Maybe you can start there.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely fascinating, Anilene. I think what you bring to the discussion is the practice side of things as well as the academic side of things. But maybe I could also just get your thoughts on how you see decolonization of psychology linking with African-centered psychology, and then we can move on to the details of how that looks in practice.
For me, as I've said, that the difficulty of what I'm experiencing, there's a post that I saw on Facebook, on Twitter, a clinical psychologist that was advertising herself. So what she did, she collaborated, where you call it umsamo, where people go and do men and all of that. This is, I call it the underground office. So the underground office was in the same space.
Why underground? Your underground gang and underground
The underground
offices?
is basically a chilled word of saying ancestors.
Oh, okay.
So we call it the underground gang. So it's the ancestral office. So she has that in the same space. She has a private room. Now the debate there was, isn't this a conflict of interest, or isn't this dual therapy? And in the way of how we understand, integrative therapy. So there's integrative therapy, there's dual therapy, and there's conflict of interest. Obviously, from the West, the colonized way of looking at things, one would then say and argue that this is conflict of interest. And for me, that was the point of actually saying, this is a conversation now about how this looks like in practice. Because we are putting academic terms, nice words into it, but what is actually decolonizing therapy? Because we all know what we know, which is very colonized, which is very Eurocentric. Now, for me, in practice, as an example, what is decolonization? It means the first thing that I do, instead of saying good morning, I say Thokozani, or I say Kamaku, or I say Makos. Already, one who understands that, they already can identify with that. And how my space looks like, it's very decolonized. As much as I don't use the same room and same space where I do my underground work and at the same time the psychological work, but they are, I call it sacred elements that are indicative of that. One of it is my identity. You see the beards. And I'll have my sniff, the tobacco there. I'll have my mat that is there. Already that suggests a decolonized way of looking at this, where people are already looking for a long chair, a long couch, or going to be asked, how are you feeling? And for me, I always ask, unjani or ninjani, meaning that I'm not only asking you, but the response that I'm getting, there's a recognition of the other and all of that. But by the time people come to see me, already they've done their research. So there have been times, Brendan, where I have to take off my shoes because probably the gang is saying, no, this time around. So I've had to negotiate space. And automatically there's a conversation already. Some people would even then ask, what does it mean for you to have this in this room? But I'm very wary of saying that the person that you have came to see is a registered clinical psychologist, and I'm also registered with the BHF. So don't be worried. You will only get to see the psychologist, but my identity already in the room introduces a decolonized way of working around these issues.
Yeah, no, that's incredible. Often, like you say, we get caught up in concepts, perhaps theories, and that's very important. And perhaps in the university space, thinking about broad concepts, but how it plays out in practice is really important. And so, thank you for that. I was also just maybe coming back to your teaching, because I know you do a lot of teaching in African-centered psychology and in therapy and so forth. You've also written in sort of social psychology and critical psychology. But I just wanted to get a sense from you about some of the challenges of the teaching space and teaching this kind of thing.
I think maybe if just briefly touch on from practice side. My therapist asked me, how are you feeling about doing this kind of work that is non-normative or non-hegemonic? I sit with guilt of the colonized mind and the colonized background. Thou shalt not do this. In psychodynamic, you're taught of the frame. You shouldn't do this and do all of that. But I've had to dance with my guilt and pleasure of doing what I love, and this is I'm doing no harm. So even with my teaching perspective, like with the master's class, they've thoroughly enjoyed, and most of them, it's for the first time in their academic life, being introduced to notions of African psychology, what this thing is. And again, there's a theoretical basis of the work that has been done so far, and people like Rattel have written a book about what African psychology looks like and what it is not. So there's a great excitement from students of receiving local knowledge and again reading scholars that is so accessible. Yes, we do have the Walter Mignolos and the rest that have written extensively about decolonization, but now to get the works of people that we know that teach us in our classrooms and all of that, it becomes more amplified for students. So my experience of as a lecturer doing this, it has been quite an amazing and liberating experience, even for me, that I'm not feeling guilty at the end of the day that when my students are confronted later in practice with African realities, I mean, how we construct and understand the DSM. It's socially constructed in pathology and psychiatry. But then again, I'm able to teach students about possibilities that beyond seeing this as psychosis, there is the possibility that there could be witchcraft, that there could be these other elements into it. And also me as a psychologist and as an academic in the room with students, that it's so accessible for them that they have someone who's actually doing this in practice. So I'm able to draw from my lived experience, from my experience as a practicing psychologist, from theory, and grounding this within a particular foundation, that it makes it so accessible for students to even try it out, to say, when I'm looking at personality disorders, what are some of the terms and notions and metaphors that we use to describe a personality disorder? In fact, what is depression in an African context? Because one may not come with the actual clinical words in practice, but they may bring metaphors like there's something in my shoulders, my head is spinning, and all of these things. So I'm able to draw from local knowledges and integrate them into theory. And beyond than just that, there's also the advantage of bringing praxis that makes it accessible for students to relate with that. Even though for some, it always feels like, as a white student, do I need to know this? Race then comes in. Is African psychology or African-centered psychology for blacks or for whites?
Or some middle ground, which which I'd love to explore with you perhaps now. There would be some who would feel that it seems either or. You've got Western and you've got African-centered.
Oh yeah.
And perhaps we feed into that. But just some of your thoughts, Anile, about making African-centered psychology and associated practices more accessible, perhaps, or more available to many. Your thoughts?
I think the problem that makes it true for us to stumble or struggle with this concept of African psychology, it's other disciplines outside that. I mean, there are many people who may identify with different kind of religious convictions. It could be Christian, it could be any. But those ideologies are socially accepted as normative ways of how to do things. Now, being a Sangoma or a traditional healer is problematically constructed in society. It's either you are a witch or you're working with dark powers and all of those things. So already, with African psychology, there's no woo-ha about it in the literature, or it's only known in Africa or in South Africa. So it's not a hegemonic knowledge system that everybody knows about it. So already there will be reservations and apprehension around people's responses in relation to that. But the bigger problem is that, again, for African psychology or for African-centered psychology to have more credibility, there's a need for more write-ups. I mean, we have people who have probably thought of African mythology or African ways of knowing and understanding, like Credo Mutwa, but his work is deemed as mythological or kind of philosophical in a way. But until we have credible work and research that's centered around that, like I've taken a personal responsibility. Most of my students, in their dissertation, there is an element of an African perspective, so as to bring value into the. One of my students is doing work around experiences of traditional queer healers, right? And there's a part where she speaks about African epistemology as a legitimate form of knowing, as a way of understanding African realities. And so for me, practically, from a praxis perspective and also from an academic perspective, to give credibility, it is when we can start doing studies that have an empirical sense of understanding participants' subjective experience of what this is, how the experience is, and all of that. That's the closest that I can come to in response to what you've just highlighted.
That's really interesting. I mean, I think you've picked up on a couple of issues, but the one thing you've said repeatedly is the need for more writing.
Need for more writing.
The need, you mentioned credible writing. But I just wanted to get your sense of how we foster that, I'm absolutely delighted that over the past few years, we now have at least a dozen scholars who I believe are writing beautifully in the field, and that we actually have a corpus of literature that we can at least start to think this through. We also, of course, have a bigger literature, Pan-African literature from the diaspora to draw on. But yeah, what are your thoughts about how to foster the writing of African-centered psychology?
I think the beginning starts with teaching African psychology, and instead of doing it in silos in the way that we are doing now, that in the department is known to be someone else's interest, I think it can be fostered as a core module that each psychology student would be registered for African-centered psychology or whatever African-centered, like we have done in the faculty, introducing that course, but it brought more to psychology, being made a module that students will then start engaging with that from as early as first year. So if we can do that, then students would know there is this possibility. And if in our postgraduate studies, we then encourage students to look for topics and subjects that have to do with something along the lines of that. So from a teaching perspective, and targeting it from as early as undergraduate, and then foster that. Then also think, with people like Chilis and many others that have written on decolonizing methodologies, starting from as that as well at postgraduate level as to what do we mean by when we speak of decolonizing methodologies? What does that look like? And how we can apply? Because as long as we know Linda Smith, her work is incredible, but it's less evident in students' work, either in when they're writing theoretical frameworks or plausible paradigms of thinking about that. So from a teaching perspective and research, I see potential, and this is where we can start targeting and foster these ideals and ways of thinking about African psychology and the whole broad concept of decolonization.
Oh, that's great, and I think the starting point of teaching and introducing it early is possibly also to grow the cohort of people who would go on to become academics or scholars or researchers or practitioners thinking about these issues. I have one final question for you. It's a tough question, Anele. What do you think are some of the traps, potential traps of thinking in an African-centered psychology way? I'm thinking scholarship.
Okay. I think for me, the trap is the need to over-justify what decolonization and African psychology means. Like, it feels like it's an effort to make people believe this thing. It's more like you're selling a product, right? And the scientific community, like, nah, they don't trust this. So trustworthiness, and I kept on using the word credibility. So the danger thing is that we may go through the trap of over-explaining what this is, and so that at the end of the day, people would lose the essence of what this is. At the same time, it will always be compared to the hegemonic way we know psychology to be psychodynamic, to be narrative, to be CBT, to be all of this and this and that. So it will always be against the grain of, and because it is what it is, psychology is that. Now, in terms of practice, people would then bring these issues. Is this human therapy? Is this integrative therapy? Which is, for me, my argument, it's integrative. But there's no sense of even scientific or Western integration of what integrative therapy is. There is no sense of what this is. One could tell you, use this, a bit of that, and bring all of these things together. So what's wrong with me when I bring a bit of this and that and that? And for instance, like I usually say, Mr. B, for me, when I refer clients to psychiatrists when they are depressed, it's fine. Whenever I see that this is not just depression and the underground gang amplifies the narrative, I'm able to say, go to Mkulu Mang Mang or Gogo who's going to help you unpack this. However, because I've got the local knowledge, it could look like this. Now, what I'm going to suggest is not an MDT involves a medical doctor, a psychiatrist, an OT, a social worker, and all of that. Now, for me, my MDT is expanded. It involves a traditional healer, a herbalist that can prescribe a certain type of medication. So, because that is not in the norm, that will be seen as a problem. Again, people will speak of ethics. Is it ethical to do this? It's ethical because I'm doing no harm. So another problem is, in terms of practice, there is no right or wrong way of a manual unless we can start writing about the manual. One person asked me, in the underground world or in the ancestral world, do we have a DSM? And I said, no ways, we can't have a DSM there because this is subjective and it's different. It comes in different shapes and different forms. In the academy, everything needs to go for trials. Needs to for validation, for peer reviews. Now there am I taking my paper to Brendan to integrate, to review integrative therapy from an African perspective. Chances are, if you're not aware of that, you're going to say this is nonsense. Okay. So having no reference of this from the scientific way of how we understand science, that's another problem. Another thing is it will always be compared to, and again, we will trust who is writing this. Even amongst African scholars, there are politics of saying that this one is superficial, this one is not touching this. And no, one of the professors wrote a very critical article about African psychology, and he was murdered for his ideals and notions, and that's how we saw it. And so within there are politics of who is who has the right, who has the legitimacy of that. When a colleague from the West writes about African psychology, that's been questioned. So those are some of the things.
I mean, some of it is complicated, and I think it's complex issues, and issues that are certainly much needed on the agenda, in the debates, in the academic discourse. And, I really look forward to engaging more on the topic.
Definitely,
and
yes.
engaging with you. Thanks,
and you see more of the work that I do around how this possibly looks like. And I've been getting a lot of interviews and podcasts around how do I resolve this. And I think it requires a different kind of bold generation like us to question and position this way of looking at knowledge systems, at looking at practice and all of that. But because of time and other constraints, and thank you for this great conversation, it's always good to translate what we write about and make it accessible for even people that may not have access to buy even the special issue that we did.
Yeah.
But this, it's on YouTube, it's available, and for the faculty to see the kind of beautiful work that we do as a department and as a university. Thank you for that.
Yeah. Thank you,
so
Anele.
much.